Mental Drain asks, what is your job? My PhD research. My PhD is fully funded, so that's where most of my income comes from. Why aren't you doing more collabs with other philosophers on YouTube? I don't know, really. I mean, I guess I'm open to it. Do you think other philosophers would be interested? I don't know. It just hasn't happened. Thoughts on William Lane Craig, John Lennox, and Christian apologetics. So, William Lane Craig, I mean, I don't know his work that well. I saw a debate with him and Alex Rosenberg about the existence of God, and I only really watched it because I like Alex Rosenberg. He's a philosopher of biology and he's done some really fantastic work. He's an excellent philosopher, and so I saw he was doing this debate with William Lane Craig. I thought, okay, I'll check it out. I don't usually watch debates, just because I don't find them particularly useful. I mean, I think that where those kinds of debates can be useful is in introducing lay people to a topic in a way that can be engaging. Like if you've got two good debaters, two people who are both able to present arguments for and against a particular view in an engaging way, then that can serve as a really useful introduction to a topic. But I mean, for me, it's, like if I want to learn philosophy of religion, I'll read some articles on philosophy of religion. I would say that William Lane Craig in this debate came across very well. He's clearly skilled at it. He's clearly skilled at presenting these arguments. And anyway, as I say, I watched it because I was familiar with Alex Rosenberg, and man, it was pretty embarrassing. He did not do a good job in that particular debate. It's probably still on YouTube, right? But if you watch William Lane Craig versus Alex Rosenberg, I mean, Rosenberg got destroyed by William Lane Craig. He gave such bad arguments. I mean, and it didn't really engage with what Craig was saying at all. Yeah, it was embarrassing. So I don't really know his work, but I still remember that. I think, look, if you're gonna do a debate, doing a debate in public and speaking to an audience, it's a very different kind of thing to writing philosophy essays, and it's a very different kind of thing to doing a philosophy lecture. It requires a different sort of set of skills, and so if you're going to go up against somebody who's clearly a very skilled speaker, a very skilled orator, very good at organizing ideas quickly and good at the persuading of a layperson audience, I mean, you should make sure you have the skills to present your side well, because, as I say, as somebody who is not a theist and as someone who likes Alex Rosenberg, that was kind of cringy to watch. Okay, yeah, John Lennox and Christian apologetics. I don't know John Lennox. Christian apologetics in general, well, seems hopeless to me. I think there are no convincing arguments for God, right? So I like the standard philosophical arguments, ontological argument, the contingency argument, the kalam argument. I don't think any of those work, right? They don't successfully establish the existence of this omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent being. But even if you get God, right, even if you establish that God exists, you're miles away from Christianity. Like, the existence of God is the least interesting and easiest part of this argument. The existence of God gets you like 1% of the way to Christianity. And that's it, right? There's a whole other thing you've got to do in order to establish that Christianity in general is true. So, like, and actually, as it happens, Christian apologetics has failed to get even that 1% of the way there. They're not even 1% of the way there. But even if you did get 1% of the way there, you're so far away from establishing the truth of Christianity. So I don't think there's any hope for Christian apologetics, but hey, who knows? Maybe I mean, it's not a field that I've engaged with a lot, so maybe I'm wrong, but that's just my initial reaction to this. It's like, I don't even buy the arguments for the existence of God. And if I did, I still wouldn't be a Christian, and you'd have so much more work to do in order to get me to become a Christian. I think that, like, look, if there was anything even approaching a convincing argument for Christianity, I'm sure I would have encountered it somewhere by now. I'm not living under a rock. I mean, at least with the arguments for the existence of God, I can see why somebody might find them convincing. I can see why somebody might engage with that literature, with things like the Kalam cosmological argument or the contingency argument or whatever. I can see why somebody might look at that and conclude that there is a supreme being. I cannot understand why somebody might think that this supreme being is a Christian God, or whatever other God. Okay, yeah. What are your most controversial / niche philosophical views? Well, I'm a relativist about epistemology, or at least a lot of epistemology, truth, justification, knowledge. I'm a relativist about all that. That's pretty controversial. I'm a much more hardcore empiricist than most people. I mean, empiricism is one of those views that a whole bunch of people will say they endorse, right? It's just sort of part of the general philosophical consensus, I guess, but in limited ways. I'm really hardcore about it. So, most philosophers are scientific realists. I'm not a scientific realist. So yeah, I think that although empiricism is not controversial, well, I guess it's controversial, but it's not unusual for somebody to identify as an empiricist. I think I take it to something of an extreme that probably is quite controversial. I'm also very attracted to anarchism. I'm certainly a fairly hardcore libertarian. That's pretty controversial. Mohammed Elwani asks, can you please share some resources that would be useful for developing a case against epistemological externalism? I don't know. That would just well. I mean, I could, but what's the problem here? I mean, just look up epistemological externalism, right? I'm not sure what exactly you'd expect me to provide here. I mean, the resources for developing a case against epistemological externalism would just be the internalist literature, or just like the literature on externalism, actually, and the internalist-externalist debate, right? Just read that. Also, what are your thoughts on Plantinga's proper functionalism? So, I mean, I don't think it works just on its, well, I think the motivation for it fails insofar as the point of the proper function condition, at least as I understand it, is to avoid Gettier cases. I mean, that's the main motivation. But the theory itself is vulnerable to Gettier cases. So, doesn't work in that sense. My main problem with this kind of theory is that I don't think there are any teleological functions. So, for me, a function is just a certain kind of effect, right? There are when we analyze, say, an organism, you break it down into parts and you identify certain causes and effects. To say that the function of the heart is to pump blood, well, all that means, in my view, right, is we're asking a certain question about the organism, such as how is oxygen delivered to all of the different parts of the body. So we have this capacity that we want to explain, and we then break it down and we see that, the oxygen is delivered by the blood, and the blood moves through the body. And how does it move through the body? Well, it moves through the body because the heart is there pumping away. So in that context, we attribute the function of pumping blood to the heart. But there's no teleology here, right? This is known as a causal role function. It's not a matter of the heart has the purpose of pumping blood, right? There's no normativity. There are no purposes. It's just that this is something the heart does, and that achieves a certain effect. And in a certain investigative context, we're interested in explaining this effect, the oxygen being spread through the body, and the heart, the contribution that the heart makes is the pumping, and so we attribute the function of pumping to the heart. But I don't think there are purposes. There are no design plans. It's not the case that the heart ought to be pumping blood or anything like that. It's not the case that it's supposed to be pumping blood. So I'm among those who take it that one of the things that evolutionary theory has done is it has eliminated teleology. I don't think it provides a scientific account of teleology, or that it reduces teleology or anything like that. I think that it's just shown us that we can do without teleology entirely. And the proper function account, as I understand it, it depends on there being some sort of objective distinction between function and malfunction. It depends on it being the case that there is, that there are ways things ought to function, and that's nonsense. Or rather, the function of the thing is what it ought to be doing in some sense, or what it's supposed to be doing. And I think that's nonsense. If you interpret the idea of proper function in a way that I would say makes sense by removing the teleological aspects of it, then I think it's just going to reduce to some sort of reliabilism. You're just going to end up saying that the belief is produced by a properly functioning process. What that's going to mean is just it's produced by a reliable process or something along those lines. So yeah, I don't buy the proper function analysis, and in general, I'm not. I prefer the internalist approach. I think that what matters is how we evaluate things from the inside, as it were, and no beliefs come to us labelled as being produced by a properly functioning process, or as being produced by a reliable process, or anything like that. So yeah, I don't buy proper functionalism. Nathan Rodland asks, where would you recommend somebody who has already graduated from university but did not study philosophy at university begin if they are interested? Well, I think that the best place to start is with the introductory textbooks, and that might be a kind of boring answer, but the reason why you should start with something that is written as an introduction to the topic is because philosophy is a kind of conversation. Whenever you read any philosopher, you have to bear in mind that they are almost certainly going to be responding to a whole tradition of philosophers before them. And there will be, there's a lot of background that they just won't bother explaining, because in the context in which they're writing, it's sort of understood that everybody knows this background. So if you come to a philosophical text without having an introduction to it, then I think a lot of it just won't make much sense, or it's going to be very, very easy to misinterpret it. So one point is just that philosophers will use jargon that's easily misinterpreted if you don't have the background. Like in philosophy of mind, philosophers will talk about intentionality, and obviously the colloquial use of the term intention is different to what philosophers are talking about when they talk about intentionality. But the other part is just that these philosophers will be talking about other philosophers, and those other philosophers will have been talking about other philosophers, and so on. And I think you need to have some sense of what that conversation is before you can really understand what those philosophers are doing. You need to understand the context of the argument. So I'd recommend picking a topic that you're interested in and then looking at some of the introductory books for it. Yeah. So I don't know if that's, a particularly interesting answer, but I think that's basically the answer. Ned Piper asks, if you could force everybody in the world to read a single book, what would you choose for maximum effect and why? Obviously, I'm not really keen on forcing anybody to do anything, but if I had to, maybe something like Carl Sagan's Demon Haunted World. There might be better books in that kind of style available now, right? But that kind of thing, something that is written for laypersons and that introduces skeptical thinking. And when I say skeptical thinking, I mean not radical skepticism, not like, brain in a vat style skepticism, but the kind of scientific skepticism that will allow, it gives people the tools to resist pseudoscience like homeopathy and UFOs and flat earther sort of things, that kind of thing is, I think, useful. And it would have to be a book, as I say, that's really written for a wide audience. So I'd probably go for something like that. Owners 8 says, do you think that the analytic-synthetic distinction is valid, or do you agree with Crine's criticism of it? Well, those aren't the only two options. I mean, there are plenty of problems with the analytic-synthetic distinction. Crine's, you can reject the analytic-synthetic distinction without agreeing with Crine's argument. Crine's actual argument, it's basically an argument by elimination, isn't it? There's two aspects to what Crine is doing. He gives his argument against the analytic synthetic distinction, and he also has this alternative hypothesis about how meaning works, the holism. But the argument is an argument by elimination. He goes through all of these attempted ways of defining the analytic synthetic distinction, and then tries to show that they don't work. And the problem with this is it seems like you could give exactly the same argument against basically every interesting philosophical concept. Well, I say exactly the same argument. It wouldn't be exactly the same argument, would it? It would be an argument of a similar structure, right? That argument by elimination. We can look at philosophical attempts, at philosophical analyses of the concept of knowledge, or the concept of justice, or whatever, the concept of rationality, and you will similarly find that all of these fail, and that all of these are kind of tied up with other controversial philosophical concepts, in the same way as it's very difficult to give a precise definition of analyticity, and we find that analyticity is tied up with other controversial philosophical concepts like necessity and so on. So I'm not really persuaded by that style of argument. I think that what all that's been revealed by that is that there's an interesting philosophical problem here. So no, I'm not really persuaded by that kind of argument. Pre-Nupitals says, Hilary Putnam once said that philosophy gets normalised in science, assumingly talking about philosophical assumptions carry on through pedagogy or otherwise inclined scientists like Einstein. Did I read that wrong? That I don't know. Okay, that sentence seems to have there's something wrong grammatically there. But okay, when do you think the nitty-gritty hair-slicing philosophy makes an impact in science or everyday life? How can something like the causal theory of reference maybe make some headway in political discussion / change, or things that otherwise matter to everyday people? Well, you've chosen the causal theory of reference, which is an interesting choice because, I know what you're getting at in general here, but I'm going to talk about the causal theory for a little bit, because the importance of theories of reference, in my opinion, has been way overstated. So I feel like this was a bad example to choose. At least it's a bad example to choose if you're talking to me, because I'm going to now have to talk about why these are massively overstated in importance and why theories of reference don't matter as much as people think they do. But look, I mean, so these theories, different theories of reference, debates concerning theories of reference, they're applied in a whole bunch of different areas. And people seem to think, or philosophers seem to think, that they have important consequences in a whole bunch of different areas, and I don't think they do. So philosophy of science is the area that I know best here, and philosophers have appealed to theories of reference to try to, for instance, avoid the challenges posed by Kuhnian incommensurability, avoid the challenges posed by the pessimistic induction. So, the like the pessimistic induction is just the argument that looks at the history of science and says, okay, we see this history of theory change, right? Like radical theory change. People have had very different theories of electrons over time, and so we should similarly expect that our current theory of electrons will change in the future. Now, the response from some people is, well, you can apply the causal theory of reference to sort of save the idea that these scientists in the past were successfully referring to things in the world, because the causal theory of reference does not require you to have correct descriptions about the things you're talking about. So previous scientists referred to electrons despite being wrong about various aspects of them. And I mean, this just seems to me to completely miss the point. I mean, what does it matter if electrons exist if we're wrong about various aspects of them, right? Like, okay, so we can say electrons exist, but then we don't really know anything about them. That's not an interesting kind of realism. That hasn't saved realism from the pessimistic induction. I mean, actually, I guess it's the same problem that entity realism has, insofar as asserting the existence of an entity is going to be empty without some sort of theoretical descriptions that are true of it, right? That you can justifiably believe are true of it. And so, yeah, I feel like I've gone on a tangent here, but the causal theory of reference, it doesn't matter, and philosophers should stop thinking that it does matter. But to answer your question about like when does the hair slicing philosophy make an impact? Well, I don't know, and actually there's not going to be anything in general you can say about that, because that's going to be context dependent, isn't it? So, okay, take say biology, right? So you ask, when does philosophy make an impact in science or everyday life? Well, take biology. It depends on the philosophical debate. Something like the species problem seems to have a fairly immediate impact. It makes a difference to scientists. Indeed, scientists themselves have engaged in these debates about how exactly we should define species. And you can similarly see how different measures of biodiversity or whatever will be dependent on how we're defining what species are. So maybe a debate about the species problem is something that scientists are going to care about. The units of selection debate, maybe. Scientists, like actual working biologists, have debated the merits of, say, group selection and species selection and things like that. So these seem to make an immediate impact, but there are other questions raised in philosophy of science that are much at a further remove, like, should we interpret theories in a syntactic or semantic way, right? That doesn't seem to make any difference. And that's actually not really a problem. I mean, I don't think it necessarily matters whether philosophy makes a difference to other fields. It just depends on what your goals are in doing the philosophy. You're not necessarily aiming to make a difference to fields outside of philosophy. But yeah, I don't see how there can possibly be a general answer to this that you would just accept overall, right? Bonus question, are there any timeless philosophical problems, e.g. meaning of life, why something rather than nothing, that will be progressed over the next century, and why? Well, I don't see any reason to expect this. I actually think that, so if I was to make any predictions for the future, I would say, in the shorter term at least, the current paradigm is perhaps breaking down. I think we first of all see a lot of philosophers intentionally engaging with other traditions. There are increasing attempts to connect analytic philosophy with, say, continental philosophy or with Buddhist philosophy. I mean, I see more and more of that, more of an attempt to like diversify engagement with other traditions, which obviously is well, presumably going to challenge current ways of thinking. And also, I think there are just certain broad assumptions, or there are ideas that philosophers have somewhat uncritically accepted, I think, that are increasingly being challenged, like physicalism. Physicalism has formed the basis of a lot of philosophical work, and there now seem to be more and more philosophers who are seriously challenging it, and I see a lot of philosophers adopting positions that would have been sort of unthinkable a few decades ago. Panpsychism is just considered completely absurd, but now there are reasonably powerful defences of it. The other thing is that I think we're going to see increasing specialisation. We've already seen that, which, will probably lead to more pluralism in philosophical methods and also more, let's say, conceptual fragmentation, like the concept of knowledge. Instead of aiming to give a just general account of knowledge, I suspect there'll be a sense that we have to apply, that we have to kind of break this concept apart for different contexts, right? That there are just many different kinds of knowledge, and in different contexts, for different purposes, we're going to be using one or the other of these different kinds of knowledge. So I don't think that there's going to be any consensus achieved on the broad philosophical questions like why something rather than nothing, the meaning of life. But I don't know. I can't predict the future, but it seems to me that if anything, it's going in the other direction. That we're going to have actually a bit less consensus for the near-term future, at least. Pratham Sanghavi, sorry if I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but Pratham Sanghavi says views on abortion. I think abortion is perfectly acceptable right up to the moment of birth. I think that the status of the fetus is completely irrelevant. It doesn't matter to me whether or not the fetus is a person with a right to life. I'm happy to just grant it. Okay, I can just be like, yes, the fetus is a person, the fetus has a right to life. That doesn't change anything as far as I'm concerned. For me, what matters is it's contained inside the body of the mother. And if one person is contained inside the body of another person, then it's okay for the container to kill the person contained within them. And it's partly I don't know. I feel like it's almost just a matter of self-defense. I think that if somebody's occupying your body without your consent, then it's okay to use lethal force against them. So, abortion, in my view, is acceptable right up to the moment of birth. Basically because I think the bodily autonomy trumps the right to life. But also, I don't really think fetuses have a right to life. So, Okay. Also, Zach Dowman also asked about abortion. He presented this argument. He says, "What do you think about this argument? Premise 1, you shall not kill a human. Premise 2, a zygote is a human being. Conclusion, abortion is a crime, murder." So, first of all, that argument isn't logically valid. Well, you'd need to state the premises a bit more carefully. You'd want to say something like, you ought not to kill human beings. A zygote is a human being, so you ought not to kill zygotes. Something like that. But I would just reject the claim that you ought not to kill humans. I think there are lots of circumstances where it's okay to kill humans. And where humans are occupying your body without your consent is a context where it's okay to kill them. Quinton Pace says, let's say you got a job at a university. Did you do so intentionally? And at what point did you intend? And at what point were you justified in intending to do so if they weren't simultaneous events? I don't understand that question. At what point did I intend to do so? And at what point was I justified in intending to do so? Why would I be... What kind of justification would be required here? Why would I be unjustified in intending to get a job at a university? What? I don't get it. Look, as it happens, I have taught at uni. I won't be teaching next year. I'm going to focus more on publications, but I've worked as a teaching assistant, and I intended to... I don't know. I've always wanted to teach. It's something I find quite rewarding. So, as soon as I was going to university as an undergraduate, I was thinking, yeah, it would be pretty cool to do a PhD and work as a teaching assistant, at least do a bit of a job as a teaching assistant. And I don't know why what kind of justification would you need for that? That's just like a goal. I mean, I don't know. That seems like an odd way to think about your goals. Like some goals, you might say, are unjustified. If my goal is to, release anthrax into a city's population, then okay, that's perhaps not justified. But what would be the problem with me teaching? That seems fine. Bonus, why should I not, under any circumstances, try to get a philosophy PhD? So first of all, it's quite a lot of work. It's tough. Well, I say it's tough. I suppose it depends on what you're interested in. I mean, I enjoy it, but it is a lot of work. It's difficult. You have to spend a lot of time just reading and writing, and it's to a degree that a lot of people might find that boring. So it depends on what you're interested in, but a lot of people would find the amount of reading and writing just wouldn't work for them. And it may also be a waste of money because, look, even if you do get funding for it, you're not going to get a lot of funding, right? Like, you don't get rich just doing a PhD. You'll get enough to survive, but like the PhD funding itself is not going to give you a lot of money. So really, if you're doing it, you've got to be doing it for its own reward. You're going to be doing a lot of work and not really getting a huge amount of money for that work. Also, so if your goal is to get into academia as a career, well, you're entering a highly competitive field. You will, in all likelihood, fail to get an academic position at the end of it, even if you do well. Even if you do well in the PhD, you're probably not actually going to make it as like a lecturer at a really great university. At least it's really difficult to break into that world. If you're interested in getting qualifications to help you in your general career, there are probably better options than philosophy. I mean, philosophy isn't the worst thing you could be doing, but it's definitely not the best either. So, like, if the goal is I want to do a PhD because then I'll be like more highly qualified, this will make me more competitive on the job market, maybe don't do a philosophy PhD. Maybe do a PhD in something else. So I guess I think that's the case against doing a philosophy PhD. Sam Cregia asks, did you study philosophy in school? I only studied it in university. Samuel Peliquin asks, do you have any want to do more videos on the philosophy of religion? Not right now. I haven't done a lot of philosophy of religion. Not an area that I find all that engaging. And I don't have any plans at the moment to do any. Also, as an atheist, do you have any thoughts on deism or pantheism? I'm only an atheist with respect to the God of the philosophers, the omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent creator of the universe. With respect to something like deism, if your concept of God is looser than this, then I'm inclined to just be agnostic. As for pantheism, that has always struck me as just changing the subject in like look, I haven't read a lot of pantheist literature here, but the idea that God is identical with nature, where we're not postulating sort of a kind of external mind or creator of the universe or anything like that. If we're just saying like God is nature, I just think that you're using the term God in a way that is so different from how it's used in colloquial language, at least within the West, that you're just not going to be like, you're failing to communicate, right? It's just misleading to talk about like nature as being God. I don't know why you would do that. It's almost like it's almost like some people just they like the word God or something. I mean, I don't know. It's really, really weird to me. It seems, as I say, really just like changing the subject. So that's about it. I don't have much more to say on that. Santa is my lord asks, what do you think is the best argument against theism and why? Well, it depends on what you mean by best. I think the most rhetorically powerful is the evidential problem of evil. I mean, if you really want to convince a theist that theism is wrong, if I was instructed to convince somebody who is a theist to change their mind, I think I'd probably go for the evidential problem of evil. That seems to me to be the argument that theists themselves find the most troubling, just in general. It's an argument that it's one that like laypersons can kind of immediately get, and they see the force of it. And there are a host of responses to it, all of which seem, at least initially, fairly implausible. I think that one is what I would choose if I was to try to convince somebody else. So I don't know if that's necessarily the best argument, though, in terms of the argument that I find most convincing. I don't know. I guess maybe an argument from just the low intrinsic probability. Maybe an argument like this, right? There's no good argument for God. There's no convincing argument that God exists. But then God must have a fairly low intrinsic probability. Why? Well, because it's a specific case of a much broader concept. So compare, on the one hand, you've got the omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent creator, right? And on the other hand, imagine an omnipotent, omniscient creator. Well, obviously, there are many more ways to be an omnipotent, omniscient creator than there are omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent creator, right? Like, this is just one instance of this. So this must have a much lower probability. I mean, I'm not saying that necessarily works, actually, because I guess some people would say that, well, no, God is a necessary being, so actually it has, the highest possible probability. But I don't know, if any argument against theism, if any argument for the proposition that there is no God could work, it would be something like that, I think. And in terms of why I'm not a theist, I just don't think any of the arguments for God are convincing. Shentifia says, have you ever tried any psychedelics? No. They are very interesting to me, especially LSD. A big part of me would like to try psychedelic drugs. I think they're fascinating, and in the right circumstances I might do it. The problem is that I'm a massive hypochondriac. I mean, seriously, I used to be more of a hypochondriac than I am. I've kind of gotten on top of it now, but it used to be a serious problem. I'm not just sort of saying this in the way that some people will say, I'm so OCD because I like things around my house to be neat. No, I mean, I was a hypochondriac, and I had to go to therapy and stuff because it seriously disrupted my life. And the problem with any kind of drug, any kind of hallucinogenic drug, or any kind of drug, just any kind of drug in general, is I think it may well spark the hypochondria again. I mean, certainly one of the things that drugs will do is they'll change your sensations. And whenever I have different sensations, if I feel different in my body, the hypochondria starts. And like I say, I'm better now. I can sort of stay on top of it now. But if I was on a drug, that's going to affect my reasoning. And would I be able to stay on top of it? I don't know. This is one of the things that really worried me when I did the alcohol, actually. And you can see me take alcohol for the first time in the video with Cole. I got the video Drunk Philosophy. That was the first time I drank alcohol. I was very concerned about this very point, right? The alcohol will affect me, it will make me feel different, and I'm not going to be reasoning sensibly. So, is the hypochondria just going to grip me? As it happens, though, alcohol has a sort of numbing effect. So you actually like don't care, or you don't exactly feel. I mean, you feel different, but you sort of don't care because you can't. You feel different in your head, maybe you feel a bit dizzy, but yeah, it just stops you from caring about stuff. So, but I don't know about LSD. People have bad trips on LSD. I'm really confident I'd have a bad trip. I would do LSD if I was very, very comfortable with the environment and the people. But that might require me to literally be like in a laboratory hooked up to equipment that's monitoring my body with medical professionals around me. That would probably be the only context in which I'd feel comfortable enough to do it. Shihab Khan asks, what's your view about Islam? Have you studied Islamic theology? I haven't studied Islamic theology. As for Islam in general, my opinion is the same as for pretty much any other religion. I think that it has an absolutely nonsensical metaphysics, which is probably not even internally incoherent. There is just no good reason at all to think that it's true. It promotes deeply repugnant moral values. It encourages dogmatic thinking and mob behaviour. I think I'm very strongly against it. Again, this is not specifically about Islam. I'm strongly against Christianity. I'm strongly against Judaism, even the religions that some people think are sort of cool now. Like there's people who are, cool with Buddhism and stuff. Those like Eastern religions. No, they're nonsense as well, and they're morally repugnant as well. And so if I'm talking to somebody who buys into this stuff, I'm generally perfectly respectful. Well, I am always perfectly respectful. I'm very civil, but that is my actual opinion. I mean, I don't want to sound like one of these kind of edgy internet atheists, right? But the truth is that I hate religion, and it's total bullshit, and I think the world would be much better without it. That is what I actually think. I can argue in a respectful way with people, and I can be civil with people, and I think that's important. But if you want my opinion on these things, that's my actual opinion. So that's what I actually think. Yeah. Sir Pancreas asks, thoughts on Kant's philosophy as a whole. Also, someone else asked you what you know about Islamic philosophy, and I'm very interested in that. Well, I don't know. I haven't studied Islamic philosophy, and I don't like Islam or really any other religion. But as for Kant, well, I'm not particularly interested in Kant because just in general, I'm not interested in older philosophy. Philosophy from before, like the 1900s, just doesn't really interest me. I read it because I have to read it. Well, except David Hume. I love Hume. But I'm very contemporary. Just in general, I'm interested in contemporary stuff. Stuff from the history of philosophy, you have to know about it, but I almost would prefer it if I didn't have to know about it. And I mean, okay, so you've asked thoughts on Kant's philosophy as a whole. Come on, dog, is there anything more specific here? I can't talk about Kant as a whole. Okay, if you want to ask me about Kantian ethics, I can say, well, I like it better than utilitarianism, but that's not saying much. Kant's phenomena-noumena distinction, I might say, things that I've said probably commit me to something along those lines too, even though I don't really want to be committed to something like that. So Kant takes it that the construction of our phenomenal world is fixed and invariant. It's like we have this conceptual scheme that's set in stone across all of human psychology, whereas I take it that the construction of the world is constantly in flux. Peter Lipton once said that Thomas Kuhn is Kant on wheels, and maybe I'm something similar to that as well. But I don't know how to talk about Kant's philosophy as a whole. So that's it. Yeah. Stefan Travis asks, are there any major philosophers you think are outright conscious frauds? Now that's an interesting question, because what exactly would fraud in philosophy actually amount to? So one thought about this would be that, okay, philosophers produce arguments, right? That's the product of our activity. And so philosophical fraud might be giving an argument that you know is flawed, or that you don't actually endorse. Like, is that philosophical fraud? If I write an essay, publish an essay, even though I don't endorse the argument in it, I know that it doesn't work, but I publish it anyway just to get a publication. Is that fraud? I mean, if that's the kind of view you take, then we're in trouble, because philosophers do that all the time. We're all frauds. And I mean, we can be more or less cynical about that kind of thing. The more cynical take on it would be to say, okay, philosophy must be producing a lot of waste, and philosophers are failing in their commitment to seek the truth. If you're just publishing articles where you don't even endorse the argument just in order to get them published, then you're not fulfilling your academic responsibility to seek the truth. The less cynical take on this kind of thing is that, well, there's actually quite a lot of value in exploring ideas that you don't agree with. When I began writing my undergraduate dissertation, I was a scientific realist. I made a conscious decision to defend anti-realism. I said, I'm going to write an argument for anti-realism. Realism was always a topic that was most interesting to me, and I just thought, by intentionally defending this idea I disagree with, that will give me a much deeper understanding of my own position. And as it happened, in the course of doing this, I realised that anti-realism was actually much stronger than I thought, and that realism had more weaknesses than I thought, and I converted to anti-realism. So if you're thinking of philosophical fraud in the way that I've just described it, as writing arguments that you don't endorse, publishing arguments you don't endorse, I don't think there's really anything wrong with that. But I'm not sure what else it could be. Okay, there's obviously fraudulent activity, like if somebody plagiarizes or something, but I mean, that can't be what you're talking about there. Yeah, I don't know. I guess my question back to you is, what do you take fraud in philosophy to amount to? Because I'm not really sure what to say about that. Stu Yang asks, when is a topic philosophically uninteresting? Is it just inconclusiveness? I don't think there are any general reasons why a topic would be philosophically uninteresting. And of course, just because a topic is philosophically uninteresting to me doesn't mean it's philosophically uninteresting to others. There are plenty of topics that I personally don't engage with, but that other people have found very engaging, and that's fine. So I don't know. Certainly, so with respect to inconclusiveness, I mean, pretty much every philosophical question is inconclusive. We don't achieve consensus in philosophy, at least not very often. And when we do achieve consensus, it's usually not because of good arguments. It's usually because of bandwagoning. I think that the consensus on physicalism, for instance, that obtained in Western philosophy for several decades, I think that was basically just bandwagoning, fashion, So, yeah, I don't know. Van Lightning, or Van Lighting 900 has a few questions here. Number one, what are your philosophical views? Well, I don't know how to answer that. I have lots of philosophical views. I mean, what are my philosophical views? About what? Like, this entire video is kind of an answer to that question, isn't it? I'm not sure even where to start with that one. Are you a moral realist or anti-realist? Very strongly on the anti-realist side, inclined towards some sort of non-cognitivism. And I don't go in for, the quasi-realist weaseling. No, I'm firmly an anti-realist. I don't think there are any moral truths. I don't think there are moral facts, moral properties. So yeah, hardcore anti-realist. Are you a physicalist, reductive or non-reductive? No, partly because I don't think that physicalism is all that well defined. What tends to happen is physicalism, like the content of physicalism, will just change as science changes. So if you were to define physicalism as there is nothing more to the world than what is specified in current science, well, that's false. We expect that there will be changes to science in the future. On the other hand, if you try to define it as saying, well, there's nothing more to the world than what will be specified in science, like at the end of inquiry or something along those lines. I don't know. Like, is there even going to be an end of inquiry? That raises a whole bunch of problems, and I think will also turn out to be just false. Also, so I have problems with how physicalism is defined. When people do give precise definitions of physicalism, I think it just turns out that there's no reason to believe that they're true. So, I'm not a physicalist. Are you an evidentialist? So there are different types of evidentialism, right? Like, so one type is a claim about the ethics of belief, and that would be the claim that we have a moral obligation to believe only what is supported by the evidence. And I'm not an evidentialist in that sense. Are there more? Yeah, okay. So maybe I would make moral claims about what people. Maybe I would say that there's a moral failing in certain beliefs that people hold, but I certainly wouldn't make the general claim that there's an obligation to believe only what is supported by the evidence. There are loads of situations where I just don't care. It's not morally wrong, right, to hold beliefs that are not well supported. Or we could be making evidentialism as an epistemic claim, which is to say that you are justified in believing a proposition only if your evidence supports believing the proposition. Well, in that sense, I'm inclined to be an evidentialist only because I think that your justification for a proposition just is your evidence for that proposition. I don't think I would even draw a distinction between those two things. So in that sense, I guess I'm an evidentialist. Are you a theist or a non-theist? Non-theist. Are you a monarchist or Republican? I mean, is anybody a monarchist? Like, yes, obviously there are monarchists out there, but how? I mean, how can anybody seriously support the monarchy? Like I get that some people might not particularly care. Okay, so here in the UK, for instance, the monarchy is far from our most pressing problem, and I don't really care a lot about it. Like, it's not something that keeps me up at night. But to actually think that the monarchy is a good thing, to support the monarchy, it just seems bizarre. I mean, it's like you're living in a different time. I don't know what possible arguments there could be for that. Although I haven't really looked it up, like I haven't really engaged with the arguments for it. So, I'm dismissing this position from what is in fact a position of almost total ignorance. But yeah, it just seems really weird to me. Who are your favourite ancient and modern philosophers? I'm not interested in ancient philosophers. I only read them because I have to read them, and actually, these days I kind of don't have to read them. I can get away with not really reading them unless I have to teach them, in which case I actually do have to read them. But for my own work, I don't have to engage with ancient philosophers at all anymore, which is just wonderful. My favourite philosophers: Paul Feyerabend, Robert Nozick, Bas van Frassen, Ian Hacking, Graham Priest, Andre Kukla. What's your educational background? Degree in philosophy, master's in philosophy, currently doing a PhD in philosophy. Vinicius Rodriguez asks, do you think that intuition has any epistemic value in philosophy? I mean, can we achieve knowledge or understanding of something through uncovering intuitions? Well, I don't think our intuitions can really tell us anything about the world. Like, our intuitions about the mind or about space or time or causality, that doesn't tell us anything about what's actually going on in the external world. And I mean, insofar as philosophers have relied on intuitions to tell us to develop their theories of the world, they are going wrong. I don't share that. I don't think that method is useful. But so there are a couple of contexts where intuitions are fine. I mean, one is what I think is sometimes called application intuitions. So whether or not something falls under a particular concept, that's fine. So Gettier cases, for instance, the question there is just, does this person who is in a Gettier case count as having knowledge? So when I look at a clock and the clock says it's 8:15 and I come to believe it's 8:15 and it's true that it's 8:15, but the clock has actually stopped and it just so happened to be displaying the right time, right? Like, is that a case of knowledge? I have a justified true belief, but the argument is it's intuitively not knowledge. Well, this is just a question of our concepts, right? And so I think intuition is fine in that context, but not conclusive. So if we take Gettier cases, I agree that they're not intuitively cases of knowledge, and that does tell us something important. But we can override intuitions. Intuitions are just one of the many things to consider when we're giving an analysis of something like knowledge. So with respect to Gettier cases, we have to bear in mind, first of all, the strengths of the justified true belief analysis. It's theoretically a very good analysis. It applies to a lot of different cases, and it also has a remarkable simplicity to it. Like justified true belief, that's very straightforward, very simple. Second, there's the fact that Gettier cases seem to be to some degree inescapable, or at least they're inescapable without making radical changes. I mean, almost every attempt to fix the definition of knowledge, to produce a more complex definition of knowledge that avoids Gettier cases, ends up being vulnerable to Gettier cases. There are ways around it. For instance, if you take it that justification guarantees truth, you won't face Gettier cases, but now that in itself seems deeply intuitive. That's going to have a whole load of deeply unintuitive consequences, right? So, it's like you're trading one intuition for another there. So yeah. Anyway, the point is this. God, this is a really rambling answer, isn't it? Has this made any sense at all? The point is this, right? Intuitions or application intuitions, I think, do matter, but I don't take them as being conclusive. Ultimately, I actually do just accept that knowledge is justified true belief, and I would say that Gettier cases just are cases of knowledge, right? It's a case of justified true belief. Knowledge is justified true belief. So in a Gettier case, the person does have knowledge. And that is unintuitive. It's counterintuitive. But ultimately, I think the strengths of the JTB analysis outweigh that. Gettier cases are near misses. It's like you very nearly failed to have knowledge. And that's why it strikes us as not being knowledge. But anyway, the point that I'm making here in a very rambling and probably confusing way, the point that I'm really trying to make is application intuitions are an instance of where I think intuitions can be useful, right? So that's a case of whether or not something falls under a particular concept. We're not making any claims there about what's going on in the external world. We're just making claims about our concepts, and I think that's one instance where intuitions are fine. Another instance where intuitions are fine is if we are developing theories which aren't really attempting to describe the world. So in moral philosophy, it's perfectly acceptable to appeal to intuitions. In fact, I'm not really sure what else you could appeal to as the basis for moral theories other than our moral intuitions. Well, actually, no, there are other things that, well, there are other tools that you have, right? Like, it's not like you only have moral intuitions, your intuitions about cases, but certainly it seems like moral intuitions are going to play a fairly essential role in the development of any moral theory. And since moral theories, on my view, should not be interpreted as even attempting to describe facts in the world, that's perfectly acceptable, right? In that context, fine to appeal to intuitions. If your theory is not an attempt to describe the way the world is, then there's nothing wrong with basing it on intuitions. So yeah, I think that intuitions can have a legitimate use in philosophy, but they have perhaps been overused. Second question: are you a naturalist? Would you mind to elaborate on that? What kind of naturalist you are, or why you're not a naturalist? I don't know what naturalism refers to here. I think this is just vague. So my inclination is to interpret naturalism as the claim that philosophy does or should adopt the same methods as science, right? That maybe we should view philosophy as a kind of science or something like that. That's how if people talk about naturalism in a philosophical context, or they talk about like naturalist philosophy, that's probably how I'll interpret them. But there are many different types of naturalism, right? Sometimes it's a metaphysical claim, a claim about what the world is like. So I'm not looking at it that way. I'm going to interpret it as a methodological claim, a claim about how we should do philosophy. In that sense, I'm not a naturalist. I don't think that there really is such a thing as the methods of science because, well, we can certainly specify in very abstract terms the scientific method. We can say something like, you form a hypothesis, you derive a prediction, you make some observations, and if the observations match the prediction, then you continue using the hypothesis. If the observations do not match the prediction, then you reject the hypothesis and try something else. So that's a very, very abstract description of the scientific method. The problem is that that's also the method used by, the mafia, for instance, right? Like the mafia will make a hypothesis about what the police are going to do, and then they will derive some predictions. So they'll have a hypothesis about how police forces work. They'll derive some predictions from this hypothesis, predictions which describe the activities of the police, and then they'll go into the world and do their drug deals and make observations. And if the activities of the police do not match their prediction, they'll change the hypothesis. So that's not science, though, right? But it's using the same kind of method. Really, the method I've just described there isn't really the scientific method. That's just like a tool that we apply in all sorts of different contexts to derive beliefs about the world. If you try to describe the methods of science in more precise terms, then there isn't going to be any unity. Like science isn't going to have a unified method. Double-blind experiments are very important in some scientific fields, but they wouldn't have an application in quantum mechanics, right? So, with that said, the claim that philosophy does or should adopt the methods of science is kind of problematic because it's very difficult to specify what exactly we mean by the methods of science. Like certainly there's overlap between philosophy and science, but that's kind of all, right? I mean, philosophers do different things to scientists in many situations. I'd also say that I don't think that philosophers necessarily have to conform to scientific results. So the fact that a philosophical theory is contradicted by science is not necessarily a reason to reject that philosophical theory. And I think that most people who describe themselves as naturalists will treat science as a kind of trump card. Like, if your theory is contradicted by science, then that's it, it's over, you know. I don't necessarily share that view. I don't think it's necessarily a problem for, well, it's a problem, but it's not a conclusive problem for a philosophical theory to be contradicted by scientific results. Okay, so I don't think I'm a naturalist. Third question, do you think that philosophy makes progress? If it does, in what sense? Had a message. Anyway, do I think philosophy makes progress? If it does, in what sense? So there are large areas of philosophy which I think are deeply mistaken, which are, I would say, not even wrong. A lot of metaphysics, for example, is deeply wrong, and just has no real hope of ever going right. And it's a problem, because if you're doing something like science, it's okay to get things wrong, because there are many other things that you'll be achieving. Science is instrumentally useful. Philosophy often isn't instrumentally useful, at least not obviously and directly so. Like, philosophy doesn't produce predictive models. Its goal is the truth. And so if there's no reason to think that you're reliably achieving the truth, then we have a problem. So there are large areas of philosophy that I think do not make meaningful progress. And I'd also say, philosophy doesn't tend to exhibit the kind of convergence that we find in other disciplines, and I don't think it's going to start exhibiting much convergence in the future. In science, you converge on, say, the structure of DNA, right? Like, there comes a point where every scientist just says, yep, that's what DNA is. And then once you've converged on that answer, you can start asking other questions and you achieve convergence on them. So having converged on the overall structure of DNA, you can ask more precise questions about the molecules that DNA is made of. Or you can maybe ask questions about, how does epigenetics work, right? How does DNA methylation work? And then you start to converge on those answers. You get this increasing convergence. We do find that. We don't find that so much in philosophy. In fact, we find it very rarely in philosophy. And when philosophy does exhibit convergence, it's, I suspect, more often a result of bandwagoning than people coming to accept justified beliefs, right? Like, it's more often a result of bandwagoning than us having compelling arguments. Physicalism, I think, is a good example of this. There was a lot of convergence on physicalism among philosophers over the last sort of century. The last few decades, there's been a broad convergence on physicalism. I don't think that's on the basis of good arguments. Having said all of this, there is genuine progress when it comes to things like clarifying questions, clarifying the relations between different concepts and different views, mapping the conceptual landscape, let's say, like just showing the options, as it were. I think there's genuine progress there. I'd also say that there can be progress in terms of conceptual explication or conceptual engineering. So taking the confused and vague concepts of ordinary language and making them more precise, and sort of constructing theories that take our folk understandings. So we take our folk understanding of something like free will. I think philosophy can make progress in terms of at least showing us more precise options there. I do think that we've learned something about what free will could be in the last few centuries of philosophical work on free will. So yeah, I think that there is progress in philosophy, but maybe not much. So there's a little. Okay, I don't even know how to pronounce this name. Zizi, is that Zizi Rezrov? Do you have any thoughts on the future development of sentient life on this planet? Read topics like superintelligent machines, human enhancement, or mind uploading. So my inclination is to say, okay, there's actually quite a lot you've talked about here, right? Mind uploading, I don't think there's any reason to believe that will occur, that that's even possible. That will depend on whether or not minds, so whether or not it's substrate neutral, right? Like it needs, in order for mind uploading to work, it's going to have to be the case that mental states don't depend on the kind of substrate that they're based in, so that you can have like a human mental state in our brain and in a computer. And I don't see any particular reason to accept that. It might just be the case that there's something about brains, organic brains, that is particularly important, or it might not. I don't know. I'm agnostic. When it comes to stuff like superintelligent machines and human enhancement, that transhumanism stuff, I'm pretty pessimistic. I don't think that transhumanism is likely to actually occur. My suspicion is that climate change, resource depletion, ocean acidification will halt technological progress before we get to the point where we are constructing these super intelligent machines. I mean, there's two sort of things going on at the same time here, right? Because we've got technological advancement occurring, but there's also these mounting problems that, I mean, there are a whole bunch of problems, any one of which would be sufficient to seriously destabilize civilization. And all of these problems are going to be converging around the same time. And I'm just on the more pessimistic side. I don't think we're going to solve those problems, mainly because we just haven't actually got any motivation to solve them. And we're only going to get the motivation to solve them once they start impacting our lives. But by that point, it'll probably be too late, I suspect. So, yeah, I'm pessimistic. The other thing is that if we did achieve transhumanism, it seems that you're also going to get much greater destructive capacities, right? So, increasingly massive destructive capacity would become more and more easily available. So as we develop these super intelligent machines, and as they become cheaper and cheaper, like somebody in this transhumanist future, why couldn't somebody just have a machine that would be able to construct smallpox virus or something, right? In a world in which everybody has easy access to nuclear weapons, the result would probably be destruction, wouldn't it? Because you'd only need a few people to decide to launch nuclear weapons, and then you're sort of screwed. So this vision of the transhumanist future, or the singularity, where there's a world of super intelligent machines and so on, I don't know if that's necessarily a positive one, because it's just in general, like as technology becomes more and more powerful and more easily available, inevitably you're going to get people with access to destructive technology. Like that's going to become more and more powerful and more easily available, and that would be a problem. So yeah, I don't know. But this I don't know. I don't know what I'm talking about. I can't predict the future, and I don't really know if anyone can. And I haven't read much about this particular topic, as is probably clear from this fairly rambling answer. So do I have any thoughts about it? Well, I do, but I don't think that you should listen to my thoughts about it, because these are not interesting thoughts. I don't think. I mean, I think this has been a good answer, but I'm going to put this answer out there because I really can't be bothered to go back and record anything else at this point. You're somewhat unlucky at this stage. You know, we've had a whole bunch of answers. It's late in the day here. I'm recording all of this in one day. I've been talking for ages, and so the quality of the answers is probably declining. I apologise for that. Okay. VLD says, is the neckbeard coming back? Well, one day it shall come back. Yes, it shall come back. Until then, there must be no tears, no regrets, no anxieties. Yang Wen Li, or Ween Li, what do you think of Strawson's metaphysical views and metaphysical conceptualism in general? Well, I don't know Strawson's metaphysical views. Also, which Strawson? Because there are two famous Strawsons. Actually, no, I do know one of the two famous Strawson's metaphysical views, Galen Strawson, his panpsychism, and I can say I'm just agnostic about that. I think that if you're talking about Galen Strawson, and if metaphysical views here is in reference to his panpsychism, then what I can say is I just don't know. There are two completely opposite theories about conscious experience, right? So on the one hand, you've got panpsychism, which just says that consciousness is everywhere, like phenomenal properties are everywhere. Even electrons have these very basic phenomenal properties. On another extreme, there's the view that you only get consciousness once you get a very great degree of cognitive sophistication. I think there's been some people who even say that consciousness really only arises once you've got language. I think Peter Caruthers has held a view, at least along these lines, right? That actually, right, even dogs, right, don't have phenomenal states, or they don't have conscious states. I think he's held a view like that. I might be getting that completely wrong, but certainly there are some people who've held the view that consciousness only arises with language, so it's very, very restricted. And then there's a whole bunch in between, yeah. And I'm totally agnostic, right? I do not know. I can't tell you whether I favour panpsychism or whether I favour this much more restricted view. So obviously, all of these views in between, I don't know that either. I am completely agnostic about that. As for metaphysical conceptualism, I'm not really sure what that's referring to. Is that referring to concept nominalism? If it is, then I'm certainly happy to accept something in the vicinity of that view. But I would say that the standard distinctions that are drawn between different varieties of nominalism, I don't really accept. And I'm just going to look something up here because, let me check this out. Okay, what? Okay, so this is annoying. My camera had stopped recording. I finished the video. I finished answering everybody's questions, but the camera stopped recording. So now I've got to go back and do this again. And it stopped at a point where I was looking up different kinds of nominalism. And I mean, I've kind of lost my train of thought here. But what I was saying is that there are distinctions that are drawn between different kinds of nominalism. And these distinctions were first, I think it was Armstrong that drew these distinctions. So I'd looked it up. There's concept nominalism, class nominalism, resemblance nominalism, predicate nominalism. And so my point is that, in my view, there isn't really a distinction between these. Concept nominalism, for example, is where is it? So it would be the view that a thing is scarlet in virtue of its falling under the concept scarlet. Class nominalism, on the other hand, is the view that the property of being scarlet is the class of all and only scarlet things. Now, I think that classes just are concepts, right? So being in the class of all scarlet things, that's just a matter of us conceptualizing this thing as being within the class of all scarlet things. So once these things are suitably understood, once these different varieties of nominalism are suitably understood, I don't really think there's a distinction between them. Even though, rather amusingly, given that I've just said this, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy actually says that class nominalism is a better theory in the same spirit as concept nominalism. So, but no, I don't think it's really a different theory at all. So yeah, we group things together in the world, right? It's not the world that does that. We construct the classes. I'm very much inclined towards that sort of view. So if that's what you had in mind when you were talking about metaphysical conceptualism, then I guess I'm quite strongly inclined towards it. But that might not have been what you had in mind. So maybe this just wasn't an answer at all. Okay, Zeitgeist Gur says, what do you think about communist/socialist philosophy? Is it convincing? Where do you disagree? Okay, so I'm re-recording this because my camera stopped working. The first time I answered this question, I did not give a very good answer. And I haven't prepared anything differently, so it's probably not going to be a very good answer this time either. Just warning you. But anyway, what do I think about communist/socialist philosophy? Well, first of all, come on, bro. That's everything from like Marxism to mutualism to anarcho-primitivism. I mean, I don't know what to say about that just in general, right? Like just communist social philosophy in general. That's so many different things. So what I can tell you about my own political stance is I am a fairly extreme individualist. I think that there are serious problems with capitalist property rights, and at least partly because I see them as coming into conflict with my individualism. I don't see why I should necessarily respect like the claims of land ownership that some other person makes. So the idea that, well, somebody owns this bit of land in virtue of the fact that somebody in the past mixed their labour with the land and then passed it down to them through the ages. So what, right? I don't care about that. Having said that, so first of all, there are serious theoretical problems with capitalist property rights, but there are also fairly deep problems with things like the private property, personal property distinction that socialists like to draw. At least there are problems with how they try to apply it. I also don't really care about like how surplus value is distributed. I don't see why like it ought to be distributed to the workers, or why workers ought to have ownership of means of production that's used to generate the surplus, etc. So, okay, what I can say is I do really like the free market anti-capitalists, people like Kevin Carson, Roderick T. Long. The book Markets Not Capitalism is a really nice essay collection on this. So they tend to, they are extreme individualists who emphasize the way in which capitalism is something supported by the state. The question is, so they will emphasize the way in which states promote hierarchical organization and inequality, and they think that freeing the market, genuinely freeing the market, would undermine that. And to some extent, like I can, see their arguments. So socializing the costs of infrastructure, socializing the costs of protection services, I can see why that would be of a benefit to like large corporations. But if I'm being honest, I can't in all honesty say that I think that their predictions are correct. I mean, I just don't know, because yes, there are certain ways in which the activities of the state are essentially in favour of the rich. But then there are also things that will tend to undermine hierarchy and inequality. I mean, so if you take zoning laws, right, the free market anti-capitalists hate zoning laws, but you can totally apply zoning laws, and these have been applied, I think, in ways that undermine large corporations. Like you can use zoning laws against Walmart, right, in particular communities. So, you know, there's an example of individualist socialists. I like them aesthetically, but I'm not sure I can say that I really endorse their arguments. So I would also say I'm definitely not an egalitarian. Any kind of socialism that's defended on egalitarian grounds, I'm going to reject. I am firmly in the individualist camp. But then I'm not sure, like, you know, even Marx, I'm not sure he was an egalitarian. Like, certainly, I don't think he like accepted any sort of moral egalitarianism. What I think we can conclude from all of this that I've said is that I don't really know what I'm talking about, and I probably don't have anything interesting to say here. I don't know, and it's late in the night, and I've already answered this question once, but it didn't record, and I've got to answer it again. And you know what? I've not done a better job. I did a bad job with it the first time, and I've not done a better job this time. So apologies for that. Okay, Zach Dowman says, do you like debates? What debates would you recommend to watch on YouTube? Well, I myself don't really watch debates. I think debates might play a useful role in introducing a person to a topic in a way that may well be engaging, provided both debaters are good speakers and are intellectually honest and so on, right? Like, I can see why it might be useful if somebody's coming to a topic for a first time to watch a debate about it. But that can easily go wrong, right? Because there's a lot of people who just aren't like intellectually honest, and or they're just bad at presenting arguments or whatever, and so you have to be careful. But yeah, debates don't really interest me much. Are you planning to stream on YouTube? No. Do you smoke marijuana? No. Do you approve of legalizing marijuana? Yes. Yes, I do. And I think that there are no sensible arguments against marijuana legalization at this point. I think it's a one argument, and the only reason why it's not legalized, like where I am at least, I know it's legalized in some places in the US. The only reason why it's not legalized here in the UK is just like inertia. You know, there is absolutely no question. To me, I just. It's crazy to me that people can oppose it. Like, if you want to have an argument about whether or not we should legalize heroin, fine, okay, but legalizing marijuana, the answer is so obviously yes. And this is especially true if you drink alcohol, right? Like, if you are an alcohol user, but you are against legalizing marijuana, then, I mean, seriously, fuck you. And you are being an idiot, right? You're being an asshole and an idiot. I'm not saying you are, in general, an asshole and an idiot, right? But in this particular context, you're an asshole and an idiot. So, yeah, I absolutely favour legalising marijuana, and I think that at least 99% of everyone else in this country should also favour legalising marijuana. It is ridiculous that that we haven't legalised it. Okay, some questions about logic. Any proof system needs proof. Can you prove logic? How do we know that the logic is correct? Well, logic is just a tool. It's not the sort of thing that can be correct or incorrect. There are many different systems of logic, and you apply them in different contexts. I don't think there is such a thing as like the one true logic that captures correct reasoning. You know, whatever that would be. What is the meaning of life? Well, yeah, what is it? By which I mean, what do you mean by that, right? What is even meant by the phrase "the meaning of life"? I can't answer the question unless I know what that phrase is asking. I don't really know what that's asking. When people talk about the meaning of life, I usually interpret them as asking about the point or the purpose of life. So people want to know, yeah, what purpose their life as a whole has. And the answer to that is it's subjective, because purposes are things that, like, we have purposes and different people will have different purposes, and like that's it. It's up to you. I would also say, though, that I think the vast majority of people actually don't have a purpose for their life as a whole. It's very rare, I think, that anybody assigns a purpose to their life, right? Like, you assign purposes to particular activities in your life. Doing this video right now, I'm doing this for a particular purpose. I want to have content for YouTube. I want to, I don't know, please my subscribers with answers to their questions, etc. That's the purpose of doing this. If I go downstairs and cook some food, the purpose is to have something to eat. So particular activities have purposes, but life as a whole, I don't think that it really makes sense to think of that as having a purpose, at least in most cases. I'd also say, look, I think that, what is it that drives people to ask about the meaning of life? My impression is that a lot of people are pushed to ask this question because they're not satisfied by the desires that they actually have, or the desires that they actually fulfill. They've, so there are all sorts of, say, sensory pleasures that we might indulge in, the pleasures of food, of sex, of listening to music. And there are a lot of people who feel dissatisfied with that, like it doesn't provide them with enough. So they assume that there must be something else, something more, right, that maybe will provide some sort of sense of satisfaction. And maybe you can try to start, like, engaging in more intellectual pursuits, but that still might not be particularly satisfying. That has its own problems. So people assume there must be some purpose to their life as a whole that will produce satisfaction. But I think that that's just confused, and I would say that the dissatisfaction that you feel is not so much in virtue of the kinds of purposes that you're pursuing, the kinds of goals you're pursuing. It's just something that's, like, intrinsic to the nature of human desire, right? I mean, if you have a goal, then you will be frustrated when that goal is not fulfilled, and once you achieve it, you'll find that it's actually not as fulfilling as you hoped, and it doesn't really make a difference what that goal is. So you should just accept that, instead of supposing that there's some sort of purpose, like, outside of you being applied to your life as a whole. Anyway, meaning of life, I think that in general it's just not something I worry about. Does a free choice or free will exist? Yes, but I understand it in a compatibilist way. I would say that free will is... So there are lots of capacities that adult humans have, normal adult humans have, that distinguish them from animals and from babies and things. Capacities like the ability to reflect on your actions, to say, should I have done it that way or should I have done it differently? Capacities to sort of have second order desires. So you can have the desire to eat chocolate cake, and you can also have the desire not to desire to eat chocolate cake, right? Like, if you are trying to diet, then you would prefer not to have the desire to eat chocolate cake. We have capacities for, like, just rational thinking and language use and arguments and so on, and we can think about ourselves and self-reflect. We have a sense of ourselves as beings separate from others with our own goals, and we reflect on those goals. These sorts of things, right? These kinds of capacities. I think that's just all that free will really consists in, is that sort of thing. And that doesn't require any particular metaphysical nature to the world. Like, it doesn't matter whether the world is deterministic or indeterministic at a fundamental level. So I'd also say, though, that if you want to say that free will doesn't exist, or free will, if you want to say that the concept of free will is just incoherent, Like I'm kind of happy with that position too. Certainly, I think that compatibilist free will it's different to what laypersons have in mind when they talk about free will, but that's as good as you're going to get. What is consciousness? I don't know. What is a main function of language? Communication, I would assume. Are people bewitched by language? Yeah, sure. I think in the sense that ordinary language can lead us into philosophical problems. It can lead us astray. But I certainly don't think that that's the case for like all philosophical problems. I don't think all philosophical problems are just a product of our ordinary language, of confusions brought on by language. Not all philosophical problems are semantic problems. How can we know we're asking the right questions? How should we ask right questions? I don't really understand this. I mean, right questions, like, that's just, I don't know, questions that you're interested in. I don't know what... I'm not even sure how to interpret these questions. You also ask... okay, so what is functionalism in theory of consciousness? What is a philosophical zombie? Okay, like it's sort of late, and I just don't want to explain. I mean, you can look this up, right? Like, okay, a philosophical zombie is something that is identical to us in its physical properties, but that has no phenomenal properties. Which is to say that, like, it doesn't have any... There's nothing it's like from the inside. It doesn't have any consciousness. So it's molecule for molecule identical, like, to me, right? It has a brain exactly like the brain in my head, and it has a body exactly like my body. But it's not conscious. It's just blank. There's nothing. There's nothing it's like to be the zombie. And the claim is that this is conceivable, and that this is a possible situation, and that's supposed to pose a problem for physicalism. But I can't be bothered to explain this, and I wouldn't give a good explanation of this because it's kind of like late, and I've been talking a lot, and this is like just a question about how these views work, right? So, I mean, I would say you should check out something like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, or the internet. The IEP is good as well. But yeah, I'm just going to move on from this. What is a function? So the function, I think I've talked about this earlier in this video. The function of some item, in my view, is the contribution that the item makes to the capacity of a system, where this is a capacity that we are trying to explain. So if we want to explain how oxygen is delivered to the different parts of the body, well, what do? Well, we have to break the body down into different components, right? We have to look at the different parts and see how they fit together and how they interact with each other. And one of the things that we will see is that the heart is a pumping mechanism, right? So you have this pumping mechanism, and there's blood coming out and blood moving around the body, and blood carries the oxygen. So this pumping mechanism pushes blood around. And so if our question is, right, how is oxygen delivered to the parts of the body? In that investigative context, we attribute the function of pumping blood to the heart. I don't think that functions are objective features of the world. Functions are just particular effects that we pick out as in certain contexts of inquiry, because they're part of some broader system that we want to explain. How not to fall into an ethical nihilism? Well, this depends on what you mean by nihilism. But if nihilism is the view that there are no objective moral values, then you should be a nihilist. That's the correct position. There are no objective moral values. What do you think about Anti-Nagalism? I don't know much about it. I do think life is generally bad, but of course others will value it differently. For me, what matters is consent, and I don't think it makes much sense to say that bringing somebody into existence is doing something to them without their consent, because if they don't exist, right? So you're not doing something to a person without their consent. Like somebody has to exist in order for something to happen to them without their consent. So I don't have a problem with reproduction in principle, right? I don't see that as problematic, even if you're bringing somebody into a life that's relatively bad. What do you think about anti-scientism? So again, this depends on how you're using the term scientism. The way that I've always understood the term is that it's the claim that the methods of science are the only justified ways of developing knowledge about the world, or the only justified ways of developing beliefs about the world. So, like, science is all there is, as it were. You know, if you're being an epistemically responsible person, if you're forming beliefs well, right, then you just do it on the basis of science. The only beliefs you should have are those beliefs that are justified scientifically. That's how I've understood scientism. Or at least maybe it's the claim that science could do this, right? So we could, and should, right, just use science in every area of inquiry. We should apply science to everything. I don't think this works for several reasons, but I think the main one here is just, look, however you define what scientific methods are, it's going to be the case that science itself will depend on certain non-scientific methods. So we gather evidence using our senses and our memory capacities. Like, I have to use my eyes to look and to read what's on the Geiger counter, for instance. We evaluate the relation between hypothesis and evidence by making logical inferences. These sorts of things are not part of science itself. I really think it would really be stretching the concept of science to say that, like, just visually perceiving things is scientific, right? To say that that's a scientific method. I think that would be absurd. But science depends on that. So yeah, I wouldn't accept science. I don't accept scientism just because science itself it partly rests on non-scientific methods. What do you think about conventionalism? There are many different kinds of conventionalism, so I don't have a general opinion on that. Why do scientists dislike a philosophy? Well, I suppose it depends on the scientist in question and on the philosophy in question. Like, some scientists like philosophy, some scientists don't. I mean, and you know, depends on the philosophy. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think there's a general answer to that. Did you read any of these books? Begini's Ego Trick, Harris's Free Will, Benatar's Better Never to Have Been. I haven't read any of them, actually. I have broad familiarity with, like, Harris and Benatar. I mean, I know of them just generally, not in much. I don't know their views there in a lot of detail. But, you know, I'm familiar with them. But no, I've never read those books in question. And that is everything. So, yeah, thanks everybody. I do hope that was of some interest. That's all.